Hey everyone, welcome to Two Car Pros. My name is Ryan, and today we're going to be continuing our LS build with part 8, putting our cylinder heads back on. If you missed all the other parts, 1 through 7, there's a link down below in the description to a huge playlist here on YouTube. I'm trying to create a video series where anybody could watch these videos and rebuild their LM7 5.3 in their garage in their spare time for a reasonable amount of money. So I also want to mention that our heads have been rebuilt by Superior Automotive in Placentia, California. We're not buying new heads. It's a decent way to save some money. And besides, the port and polish work that they did on these heads is A+, and I can't wait to see what they do on the dyno. Before we jump into this, I want to mention that this build is sponsored by Summit Racing. Make sure you buy all your speed parts over at summitracing.com. They have been super cool throughout this entire build. They've sent me a bunch of really awesome parts, and I've left links down below in the description to everything I've used so far over at Summit. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and put some heads back on our engine. Okay, so today's journey is going to start off 24 hours ago when we put our roller lifters in some oil. You want these things to soak in oil for at least 24 hours and maybe bat them around with your finger a little bit just to make sure every single air bubble gets out of there. You don't want any air when you're putting your lifters in. The reason we're doing this is because we want oil to get into the hydraulic part of the lifter, so there's oil in there upon first startup, so you're not trying to start it with no oil inside of the lifter itself, and it's just a good idea for lubrication purposes. The lifters we're using here today are a Summit Racing part, sponsored by Summit Racing. They sent these bad boys over. I have a link down below in the description to this exact part. So you need 16 of these lifters. They come 4 in a box. We also have our roller lifter retainers sent over by Summit Racing. Thanks a bunch, guys. And these are gonna go on top of our lifters to make sure that they're held in place. They also come with the necessary bolts, which is super handy. So you need these and you need these to get started on lifter installation. Okay, so we're over here at our engine. I have the engine tilted so it's level with the ground. I don't usually do it that way, but because we're installing this on camera, this is an easier way to film so you guys can see it too. So this is where we're gonna be working. If I was doing this normally, I would have the oil pan parallel with the ground instead of this head surface, but filming purposes. So those are our 2 lifter bores right there. So before we get started, I'm gonna take some Permatex Ultra Slick, link down below in the description, and I'm just gonna squeeze some into each bore. It's okay if it gets on the sides and the lobe. You kinda want it on both. Remember, you can not over lubricate, but you can under lubricate. It's always better to be on the safe side. So with this lifter, it's a roller, so it needs to be installed on the same rotational plane as the camshaft. It can't go in sideways like this. So this rolling surface needs to be on the same plane as your camshaft when you're installing it. And that should just drop right on down, just like that. And you can do the same thing for this one as well. There we go. The good news is all the lifters are exactly the same, so just do this 16 times. So we have all our lifters installed, and I have zoomed in on 2 here. And you might notice that these flat spots aren't exactly parallel with this surface here. So we can grab a pair of needle nose pliers. You could even use your fingers, they're not in super tight. And we just want to rotate them so that way those flat spots line up and are nice and parallel with this surface, so that way our retainer goes on nice and easy. So we're going to go ahead and take our lifter retainer. I've already dipped the tips of it in oil, and it only goes on one way with these divots facing downward towards the pistons. And we can just force that on just like that. Perfect. And then we can replace our bolt and snug that down. I'm just going to tighten this up. Now on tightness, I'm just gonna go wrist tight on this because the torque spec is like 9 foot-pounds. I don't even have a torque wrench that goes that low, so just snug is good. It doesn't have to be insanely crazy Hulk tight. Now this is exactly the same for all of the lifters, so just do it 3 more times. So now we can move on installing our cylinder heads, but before we do that, we need to take a look at our head gaskets. We have these from General Motors. There's our part number. I will leave a link down below in the description. These were sent over by Summit Racing because we are sponsored by Summit Racing. But unfortunately, they don't make head gaskets yet. So we're gonna go ahead and use this nice GM stock replacement. It should be more than fine for us. Check that out, they're even multi-layered. Very cool. So your head gaskets are exactly the same, doesn't matter which one goes on which side, so we can take these over to the engine. So before we get started, go ahead and clean the mating surface for the head very thoroughly with carburetor spray. Make sure there's no leftover gasket material, any kind of oil, anything that's not engine needs to be gone. And then we can introduce our head gasket here. There's only really one thing you need to worry about with a head gasket, and that's engine orientation. So engine orientation meaning where the front of the engine is, and that's over here where my right hand is on the left side of your screen. So where this says front needs to point that way. So you can flip them over to make them work. Just like that, it says front right there. So we know this is on right. So the really cool thing about an LS is that it comes with a cast aluminum cylinder head. These are actually our stock heads that we took off that really gross, grubby motor that we started with. What we had Summit Racing send over is our valve, springs, retainers, and keepers. So we thought instead of wasting a bunch of money on getting aluminum heads, well, we already have aluminum heads, so why not rebuild them? So we sent these over to our good friends at Superior Automotive, and they did a port and polish job. You can see on the cathedral ports that they are a little bit wider than stock, so these are a little bit bigger. And then in our combustion chamber, you can see that these are stainless steel valves, and those can handle more pressure. They're quite an upgrade. Not to mention that this combustion surface is nice and polished, and all of these surfaces have been deburred. They also resurfaced the mating surface to the engine to make sure that this is totally flat, but we're going to double check it just to be sure. And then on the exhaust side, they also ported it and polished the inside, and you can see a little bit of white down there. That's our assembly lube for the valve. You can see way down in there, it's kind of tough to see on camera, but the intake has also been ported and polished. So these are a serious upgrade for our stock heads. And if you're having your heads rebuilt at an engine shop, go ahead and make sure that they put in the two freeze plugs brand new, because the freeze plugs are in the heads and not the block. So included with our rebuilt head, we got this handy little card. It shows our spring height at 1.81 inches, how much pounds of pressure it's under at 0.6 inches, and where the spring is completely out of travel, also known as bind, at 0.71 inches. So the next thing I'm gonna do is I have our head up on a couple of wooden blocks just so it's nice and parallel with the ground, and I have a square that is known to be very, very flat. And we're just gonna set that on the mating surface. I'm gonna take a 2000s feeler gauge and just make sure there's no glaring giant gaps, because if there is, then the head's not level and it needs to go back to the machine shop to be resurfaced. Just do that a bunch of times up and down the head to make sure that this surface is as level as possible. So what I've done is I've installed one of the spark plugs, just wrist tight, and I have my head nice and level, just like before. And what I'm gonna do is take some water and fill up this cavity. Now, some people like to use gasoline. I really don't like to, because it's dangerous, corrosive, and it stinks. So water's good enough. We're just gonna fill up this cavity, and the reason we're doing that is we're checking for valve leaks, because if there's any kind of valve leak, that'll let combustion pressure escape, which is the exact opposite of what we want. But I don't see any bubbles. This looks pretty good, but what we're gonna do is take a look at the intake valve on the back side of it and the exhaust valve. So we can look down into the intake port. You can see that there is absolutely bone dry. So the intake is good. Now we can check out the exhaust. A little harder to see, but on the exhaust side, it is also bone dry. So go ahead and do that for all 8. So it doesn't matter which head goes on which side. There is only one head. Just make sure that your exhaust ports are pointing the right direction. I mean, it can only go on one way. There's no incorrect way. There's only the one correct way. And you can just set this down. And don't worry if you don't get it on the first try. You can kind of maneuver it around until it gets on those dowels that were right here. And it's nice and set on there, so we're ready for bolts. So let's talk about head bolts. Today we are going to be using some genuine GM replacement bolts sent over by Summit Racing. Thanks a bunch, guys. And for this LM7, there are 2 generations. There's an early generation and a late generation. I have a sheet here from Summit, Gen 3 or Gen 4. We have Gen 3, so we need 3 different types of bolts. Depending on what you're putting together, make sure you get the right head bolts, and all that information I will leave down below in a link in the description, straight from Summit Racing. So we have these bolts, our long guys, those are our M11 by 155 millimeters. We have these middle ones, those are M11 by 101 millimeters, and then our small ones, which are M8s by 46 millimeters, and I'll refer to all of those as we're bolting it on. So installed on here, some factory installed Loctite or thread sealer. It kind of does double duty on that. And then I also want to say these are torque to yield bolts, so if you torque these down, and for whatever reason or another you have to take the head back off, throw them away. They're junk. So before we get started, I also want to point something out on these instructions. It says right at the top, if you're using aftermarket bolts or studs, follow the instructions that came with your new fasteners. We have the stock ones, so we're going to go on the stock procedure. So I'm not going to torque these down to start with. I'm just going to put them in finger tight. And I'm going to start with the oddball middle size bolts because they go in here and here, and those are the only ones that kind of don't really make sense to me. All the other ones, the lengths make a lot more sense. But what I want to do, and that's why I have this container out, is put a little bit of assembly lube under the head of the bolt. And you're going to want to do this for every single bolt, so I'm not going to mention it again, but make sure there's some fastener lube underneath there. And then we're just going to drop that in, give this one the same treatment. And this is only for a Gen 3. The Gen 4 is different. So I'm just going to get those started with my fingers, just like that, and now we can move on to all the rest of the bolts. So we can go ahead and drop in our longer bolts, and they're pretty easy to find out where they're going to go. They're basically going to go everywhere that isn't the small ones on the intake side. So there is 5 here, and there's 3 inside where our rockers are going to go. Just like this. And again, we're just going to start these by hand for right now. Don't worry about getting them tight or in any kind of sequence. We're just getting them started. Then we can get our little ones, and those are going to go on the intake side. Let's get those started as well. So we're just going to snug these down. I'm not torquing nothing yet. I'm just putting them down in sequence like that to make sure the head goes on nice and level, but we're not going crazy. I'm just taking the slack out of it. 3 next door. 4 is over here. 5 is this one. 6 is this one. There we go. 6 is that one. 7. Yeah, 7 is this one. It's interesting. 8's over here. 8. 9 is just above that. 10 is on the other side. And then I've adjusted the engine a little bit so you guys could see it better. And now that we've done the big bolts, we can do the small ones. And we'll start with number 11 here. Let's get those a little snug. There we go. 11. 12 is this one. 13 is this one. 14 is this one on my far left. And our final one, Mr. 15, is over here. And once I've gotten this one, you know, with the slack taken out of it, then we can go and do our torque figures. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to do our first pass of torquing, and our first pass is only going to involve going through bolts number 1 to 10, all at 22 foot-pounds. So let's go ahead and do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So our first pass is complete. Our second pass involves us getting our torque angle instrument out. Before we get started tightening anything, just make sure your socket is all the way down on the head of the bolt. You don't want it to slip right off. So make sure you have your 15mm loaded. So I have my torque angle wrench out here, and we're gonna go ahead and set that up to 90 degrees. So it's nice and locked in, and we're just gonna go in sequence like we normally would, but instead of having a foot-pound, we're gonna go in degrees. So put that in, go in sequence, starting with number 1. Make sure you give yourself plenty of room to work too, because you're gonna be pulling pretty good. There's 90. After each time you use the degree, you need to reset it back to 90 so it doesn't try to add up everything. So you can go to number 2 again. Pull that to 90. There we go. Reset. Go to number 3, which is up here. And I want to say, don't try to eyeball this. Go down to Harbor Freight and just buy one of these. They're not very expensive, and it's nice to have a precision instrument. So we're going to go ahead on number 4 here. Pull that to 90. There we go. Reset. Number 5. Start on number 5 here. Pull this one to 90. And then move on to number 6. It's to 90. Move on to number 7, which is just next door. Very good. Reset. Go to number 8, which is all the way over here. Very cool. Reset. Number 9. Awesome. Reset. And number 10. Excellent. So our second pass has been completed. We can move on to our final pass. Now for our gen, basically all the big ones are going to be 90 again, but this one, number 9 and number 10, are only going to be 50 degrees. So we have to keep that in mind while we're tightening it. If you have a Gen 4, they're all the same, so they made it a little bit easier as gens went on, but we have to be aware of that because we have a Gen 3. Start at number 1. Oh, my torque wrench needs to reset. There we go. 90. There we go. Move on to number 2. Number 2, pull into 90. There we go. Reset, move on to number 3. There we go. Reset. Number 4 is right here. Awesome. Reset. Move on to number 5. There we go. Move on to number 6. Awesome. Reset. 7's next door. Reset, do number 8. This is our last one at 90 degrees. Perfect. Reset. Now what we're going to do is set our torque wrench down to 50 degrees. So with our degree torque wrench at 50, now we can do numbers 9 and 10. This one's 9. There we go. Reset. Do number 10 over here. There we we go. Now the big bolts are all done, and I know what you're thinking. I didn't tighten the M8s. Well, the M8s you do last, and those are 22 foot-pounds. So now we can move on to our M8 bolts. You do these absolutely last. They're a 10 millimeter, and you torque them down to 22 foot-pounds in this sequence, starting off with number 11 here. Here's 22. Oh. And then we go next door for number 12. Hop one over for 13. And then go all the way over here for 14. And then finish with 15. And our cylinder head is properly installed. So while the heads are the same, one thing I wanted to point out is that since this head is on the driver's side, this port needs to be open, because on the passenger side it's blocked off. So that's the coolant temp sender port, and that needs to be open, so that this needs to be open on the driver's side. And then of course, at the end of the day, always protect your investment with a nice engine bag, link down below in the description. Although mine's getting a little dirty, it might be time for a freshie. So that's how to replace the heads on your LM7 LS. It was a little more tricky than a traditional small block or a big block, or an older engine that doesn't have torque to yield bolts. This was a little trickier than that would be, because those are just one torque setting. This has a couple different stages, as you saw, so it's a little more intensive, but totally doable. Just follow the video and go along with it. I've also left a link down below in the description to the paper instructions. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope I've earned your subscription here on YouTube today. Also, you won't be missing any LS videos that will be coming very, very soon, so make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time.